I first heard about the man in the TV from my great-uncle Bernard. He'd been a film editor in the 50s and early 60s, and while he hadn't worked in Hollywood in decades, he never lost his love of movies and TV shows. Over the years, he'd collected a massive wealth of both. Everything from antique original film prints from the early days of cinema to laser discs, DVDs, and even a few Blu-rays before he died. That's why, when I was deciding on the theme of my final project for my capstone film class, I went straight to him, despite being a bit nervous about visiting him after such a long time. It was strange. I had vivid memories of my great-uncle when I was very young. He had been fun and funny and energetic, and even though he lived a couple of states over, there were never more than a few months that went by before he stopped in to visit a day or two, full of stories and jokes and excitement. But then it stopped. I didn't see him again until my high school graduation, and he seemed much older and stranger than I remembered him. He was nice enough as he patted me on the back and gave me an envelope with a large check in it for a graduation gift, but soon after he was gone. When I asked my mom where he'd went and what was wrong with him, she hesitated to answer, and when she did, I could tell that she wasn't telling the whole truth. He's just been through a lot. He lost his wife a couple years back. He's getting older, and sometimes that makes people strange. But it's nice that he came, wasn't it? It was. But more than his visit, what stood out to me the most about that night was how Mom had responded. It was the first time I'd ever known her to lie to me, and at the time I didn't understand why. Still, when years later I was in graduate school and decided to go visit him, I didn't mention it to her. Instead, I tracked down his number and called him myself. Hello? Uncle Bernard? This is Toby. Your great-nephew, Toby, I mean.
Oh, hey there, Toby. Good to hear from you. Everything all right?
Yeah. I'm actually finishing up grad school this year. A film, if you can believe it.
Oh, isn't that wonderful? It's a great profession, I'm here to tell you.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. Well, the reason I'm calling is because I want to do great on my final project and for one of my classes. I was thinking about finding some really obscure movie or TV show and doing a paper based on that. I've tried searching the internet, but that's just the same stuff over and over again, you know? So I was wondering if you still had your collection.
Yeah, it's quite a preoccupation of mine.
He paused when he spoke again. There was a new tension in his voice.
But I don't know if it's anything you'd be interested in.
I doubt that. I remember Mom always talking about how you had more movies than anybody on the East Coast. He gave a brittle laugh.
Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I do have quite a lot.
Another lengthy silence, and then,
very well. You're welcome to come and visit, and give you access to quite a selection for you to pick from, if you're sure you're interested in coming all this way.
I told him I was, and the next weekend, I headed there to see what I could find. At one time, Bernard's house had been beautiful. A sprawling 5,000 square foot, it sat on the middle of a 10-acre of lawn that was still well manicured and maintained, even as the house squatted in the middle, slowly rotting. Or maybe rotting was too harsh of a term. Disrepair and decline? Definitely. But nothing that cleaning and painting couldn't largely fix. Still, seeing the state of things made my stomach clench a little. Was this just a preview of how Bernard himself was going to be? But the man that opened the door was much like he'd been before. If anything, he was closer to the old Bernard I remembered from my youth, rather than the pale, worn, thin man that had come to my graduation a few years before. This version of him was energetic, if a bit jittery, and he seemed genuinely excited to have me there. Giving me a quick hugging handshake, he ushered me inside, and for a moment I felt relief that it was just a nice, normal house. No trash on the floor or mazes of old newspapers, just a weird but tidy old man that needed someone to paint his house. As we stepped further into where the first doorways opened up, my heart began to sink. There was very little furniture in the rooms, and what was there was pushed haphazardly against the walls. That was understandable, however, as there was no room for that stuff anywhere else. The rest of the room was devoted to his collection. Rack after rack filled with banker boxes, film canisters, binders, and various other containers, all neatly stacked, labeled, and organized. On the one hand, it was incredibly impressive, and on the other, I'd half expected a rat's nest of old junk to have to go through. The symptoms of hoarding or some other compulsion that had spiraled into chaos. But this was the opposite of that. There were catalogs for each rack at the ends of the row, and while I didn't understand the system of order and organization he was using at a glance, there was no question that there was such a system in place. A degree of volume and precision that even just walking through the front rooms seemed to border on insane. Particularly when I felt I already knew the answer to my next question. There's more than just these 2 rooms, aren't there? His face split into a grin. Oh yeah. Much, much more. There were 19 rooms in my great-uncle's house, and at least 15 of them were filled with more of the same well-organized racks of movies and shows, all labeled and categorized as meticulously as the first rooms I'd seen. The kitchen and the bathroom and one bedroom were the only areas free from the collection, and despite my protests, Bernard insisted I'd take that bedroom, as he had a fold-out couch in his office. I'd seen his office, and wondered how he'd actually pull out a bed in there with the rows upon rows of 1970s sitcoms and westerns occupying the space, but he was adamant he'd be fine and slept in there much of the time anyway. And I say at least 15 rooms because there was a final room at the back of the house that he told me was off limits. He gave the impression that there were more films or something similar in there, but he wouldn't give me any details, and I thought it was rude to press the issue, so I just agreed to stay out, and we moved on. We had lunch, I got my stuff unpacked, and by the late afternoon, I was starting my dive into the treasure trove. His house was actually ideal for what I was doing. He had high-quality equipment for viewing both modern and older formats, and despite the constant crowding from the collection itself, he'd allowed sufficient workspace throughout to easily view things in different rooms, depending on what kind of media you were looking at. As for Bernard himself, he would occasionally come by and check in on me, telling me a story about something I was looking at or where he discovered it and rescued it from obscurity. But to a large extent, he left me to my own to explore the collection as I wanted. The deeper I got into looking at everything, the more I realized how much I'd underestimated how long this might take. While everything was well organized, the content of the collection itself was dizzyingly eclectic. This wasn't a man who had just salvaged hidden gems or rare prints of acclaimed films and shows. He had some of that, sure, but most of his collection was strange stuff I'd never heard of, and that I doubted many people had. A Canadian film about vampire bikers made in the 1940s and set in a futuristic 1960s America. I just scrubbed through it quickly, but there was some kind of subplot about bears developing telekinesis. A pilot for a TV show about a family with a robot butler. It was generally played for laughs, but twice during the episode it became clear that the robot was secretly trying to murder his family and kept being stopped by bad luck and circumstance. The episode ended with the youngest son, Johnny, walking out on the robot mixing rat poison in with the family's evening meal. This moment of terror was punctuated by a canned ooh from the audience, followed by raucous laughter as the credits began to roll. A documentary about teaching parrots to quote poetry. And on it went. A lot of things I looked at in the first couple of days were boring and pedestrian, bizarre only in the fact that anyone bothered to collect them. But scattered among them were enough gems that were either quirky or interesting enough to warrant a project all on their own. The longer I looked, the more I found. And while it was exciting, was also overwhelming. I didn't know what to pick, and I wasn't sure if I could find out a lot about these most obscure productions unless I learned it from my uncle. I brought up doing an extensive interview with him about his film collection, and initially he was resistant to the idea. But I think he could tell by the third day that I wasn't making as much progress as I'd hoped, and so he agreed to answer any questions I had that night at dinner. I started the interview off more formally. I told him I was going to record him and had a few pages of questions I'd scribbled down to give him some structure to what I was asking. I didn't mention it to him, but as I worked through those questions, I'd come around more and more to the idea that my project should be about Bernard as much or more than any individual film. His love of stories and films, his meticulous and odd collection of so many obscure things that most hobbyists would pass over or ignore. So I started with questions about him and his life. How he got into making movies, what made him stop, and what led him to start collecting. His answers were somewhat interesting, and Bernard was always an engaging conversationalist, but it wasn't until I got past those initial questions and we started just talking that I felt like we were getting somewhere. He told me stories about tracking down a barn full of old silent movies that were somehow actually still largely intact despite their typical fragility. About bribing a Brazilian customs officer who was threatening to seize a duffel bag filled with Betamax tapes of Japanese game shows from the 1980s. Every story was funnier and wilder than the last, and it was clear that Bernard was enjoying having someone to share these stories with. When he started getting into finding an impounded car that had a cache of DVDs in Kansas, I laughingly stopped him for a moment. How are you finding all these things? I mean, is it all through classifieds and stuff, or are you actively hunting things down, or... He grinned and gave me a small shrug. Lots of ways, really. When I started out, it was mainly going to rummage sales and occasionally finding a mail order company that was looking to sell stuff cheap. A lot of that stuff, well, it's just the same garbage over and over. He chuckled. I know you think I have a ton in there, and maybe I do. But over the years, I've discarded 10 or 20 times as much, especially at first. Referring back on that earlier note, I interjected, because you want to keep stuff that has merit and other people might have forgotten about. He nodded. Yeah, that's a big part of it. And over time, I've developed a lot of ways of finding the kinds of things that I'm looking for. It's just like anything, I guess. The deeper you go down into a particular hole of interest, the smaller the pool of people becomes. Where I started with swap meets and widows, I wound up making contacts around the world that specialize in looking for this kind of stuff. Weird, obscure stuff that still has quality about it. His smile faded a little. Other stuff, too. And thought about the room that he kept locked. Have you ever found, extreme stuff? Like snuff films or something? His smile was gone now, but he gave another smaller nod. I have. I don't keep anything like that, of course. Filthy stuff. Most of it's fake. But yes, you have to be careful swimming in the deeper pools of the film discovery community. Some sick people out there. I've had a couple of times where I've had to notify the authorities when I get wind of someone potentially hurting others. Yeah, well, I knew you wouldn't have it, but I mean, that's a good story that you helped them get caught. Like, what about some of the really weird stuff? Like the show about the robot butler that's trying to kill his family. How'd that ever get made at all? Bernard didn't smile again, but he did give a brief laugh at the robot butler's mention. That was shot in Arizona in 1991. The supposed pitch was that it was supposed to be a weird and dark sitcom with an edge. Bear in mind that Twin Peaks had come out the year before, so there was some market for that kind of thing, though most never got past pitching. But the guy that made this, his father was a decently rich producer. I think everyone knew it wasn't going anywhere. It was way too much for the network to pick up. But that happens a lot. People call in favors, make dead-end projects to spread the wealth, that kind of thing.
He rubbed his lip. Still, I think the guy that made it must have been pretty passionate about it. I quirked an eyebrow at him. What makes you say that? He started to respond, and then waved his hand. You don't want to hear about that stuff. Frowning, I shook my head vehemently. No, I do. This is cool as shit. He did smile a bit then. Fine. Give me a drink, maybe two. Then I'll tell you more about the butler. Bernard was sipping on his second glass of bourbon when he cleared his throat and started back to telling his tales. So the guy who made that robot butler pilot, his name was Bertrand Stokely. Not exactly a glamorous name for the big or small screen, but the Bernards of the world aren't in any position to judge. Best as I can tell, he only ever shot 3 things commercially. A couple of ads for soap companies in the late 80s, and then the Robot Butler TV pilot in 1991. Naturally, it didn't get picked up, and he never made anything else, so that's the end of it, right? Except it's not, because I've got a copy of another TV show that claims to have been made in 1994 with a robot butler that wants to kill his human family. Except that one had 4 episodes. It was in the middle of shooting the 5th and 6th when something happened that stopped production for good. I stared at him incredulously. So what? Someone else took that weird idea and tried to copy it, and they actually made it a show? He gave me a strange look. That's what I thought at first, too, but when I actually got the copies of the second show and watched them, I realized something else was going on. The father and mother, they were the same actors. So was little Jack, or John, whatever his name is. Johnny. Bernard pointed with his nearly empty glass. Yeah, him. That kid looked a little older than he had in the original, which makes sense if it was made a couple of years later. So it was the original show being made again? Same plot and everything? He waggled his hand slightly, and the bottle of bourbon sloshing around. Kinda, sorta, but not exactly. The first episode is almost shot for shot like the pilot, except it's a few minutes longer. After... who'd you say? Johnny? After Johnny sees what the robot is doing, the robot convinces him it's for the best, that he's trying to make a better version of the family for them both. So the boy helps him poison his family, and then they take their bodies down into the basement. The next episode, new versions of the family are back upstairs like nothing ever happened. The mother is the same, but the father and older daughter are different this time. Over the course of the episode, the pattern somewhat repeats in every episode, though the parts I've seen of 5 and 6 were going in an even stranger direction. I wondered if he was drunk or just full of shit, but despite the oddness of what he was telling me, I thought I believed him. That's so fucking weird. Who made that version of the show? The same guy? He drained his drink and shook it at me. I have to pay the toll. When I was back again with another drink, he continued. Again, you're riding the same train of thought I was at the time. I checked, and it wasn't Bertrand Stokely. It was Bertrand Stoker. He changed his name? Like, slightly? Why? Bernard shook his head. That's the thing. He didn't. Bertrand Stokely killed himself the week after the original pilot was filmed. Oh, damn. So what, he filmed 2 versions before he died? No, I don't think that's possible either for several reasons. He held up a finger as he ticked off each point. First, like I said before, the actors that are the same do seem older than before, especially the boy. Second, one of those actors had a variation on their name in the second time, too. I think the last name was the same, but the first name was different. Third, there were a handful of times on the second batch of episodes that events or pop culture is referenced that wouldn't have existed in 1991. Like what? The Jurassic Park movie, for one, which didn't release until June of 1993. The Waco thing, where all those cult members died for another. That was in spring of the same year. Jesus, on a sitcom? He shrugged. Yeah, but remember, this is the same show that is murdering and resurrecting the family every week. Point being, stuff that wouldn't have been known to reference when Bertrand Stokely was still alive to make it. He took a deeper swig as he went on. More than that, there are the references to other things that are clearly supposed to be similar type references to other events or movies or other things, but they're things that, at least as far as I can tell, don't actually exist in our world. I paused at that last, but pushed on with one more obvious question. Like what? Bernard shook his head slightly. I don't remember them all, but the one that stood out the most was Sonic Man. They talk about a Sonic Man movie, some superhero movie with Nicolas Cage in it, in the same breath as Jurassic Park, like it's a real thing. I felt a nervous chill creeping up my spine and pushed it away. Okay, but it's obviously some weird shit anyway. Is it that strange that they mixed up and made up some movie with real stuff? He finished his drink and stared down at the glass. The thing is, that's not the only time I've seen that movie referenced. At last count, I have approximately 21,345 pieces of media in this house. And across those, I found at least 20 references to the Sonic Man movie franchise. I've also found over 300 repeated references to other events or popular culture that does not exist in our world. And I'm not talking about things that are obviously made up for the story being told. I'm talking about matching references to the same thing across different movies and shows made years apart with no apparent connection other than they're aware of the same things. Things that never happened here. My mouth felt dry as I forced myself to ask the harder question. You keep saying, our world. Do you think this stuff is from somewhere else? There was no warmth in his smile this time. Well, that would be crazy, wouldn't it? I shook my head. I don't know. It does sound crazy, I guess, but I don't think we know everything there is to know either. Maybe it's like alternate realities or something. My answer seemed to mollify him a little. Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I pushed on. Where did those things come from? The ones that seem off from our world? Bernard shrugged. Not one place. Not even a dozen. They just come in with other things. If I didn't collect so much and pay so much attention, I'd never even know the oddities were there. Have you ever tried asking around about it? See if anyone else has noticed the same stuff? He pursed his lips. At first, I did, a little. But some of these circles are... And I don't mean this unkindly, as I may be counted among them by many. Lonely nut jobs looking for a bit of magic in their lives. You're a lot more likely to get made up bullshit or conspiracy theories than you are any useful information. Experience has taught me to only trust what I can see for myself. We sat for a few moments in companionable silence. When I spoke next, I realized I'd woken Bernard up. Would you be okay with me looking at all this stuff? Both the things you found and seeing if I could find more? Blinking blearily, he stared at me for a moment before nodding. Yeah, I think so. But we need to agree. Agree before you put things in your paper. I nodded. Sure. No, I understand that. Bernard was already drifting back off to sleep. We can talk more about it tomorrow. I let him doze a few minutes more, and would have left him in his chair, but I was afraid he'd be stiff if he slept like that all night. Gently shaking his shoulder, I told him I was going to go to bed.
I was startled when his eyes snapped open, wide and fearful, and he gripped my arm hard enough to hurt. Don't let him see you. Yanking my arm free, I assumed he'd been having a dream, but I couldn't help but ask anyway. Who? Don't let who see me? Tears were forming in the corners of Bernard's eyes. The man in the TV. He keeps staring at me. Do you remember when the moon blinked? I don't suppose you do, or that's what I assume anyway. From what I've heard, it didn't seem to affect anyone else outside of this small town, outside of Grady. I don't understand how something like the moon completely blinking from existence is something that could be territorial, but maybe I'm just focusing on that aspect of things in an effort to come to terms with the reality of what happened that night. Somehow, Henry Rowland, old man roly-poly as folks around here used to call him, somehow he knew it was coming, or at least had an idea of it. I'd come to understand that later on. He'd always seemed like a bit of a mad old guy, the quintessential nut of this little slice of America. Of course, this town has no shortage of those types. There's something about this place, you know? Something dark, lingering beneath the surface of it. I was born here, and grew up with tales of lizard people living underneath the woods, and even ancient gods presiding over mountains just outside of town. Being the only place I've ever lived, I can't speak to whether or not this is normal. Some haunted history defining the inherent madness of some of the elders. For all I know, every town has mysterious legends inked in blood, dating centuries back. But this one, well, I have experienced the darkness more viscerally than I ever could have imagined. Old man Ronald lived just a few houses down from me, so when he started his, renovations to his house, I didn't really know what to think. Other neighbors didn't seem to think much about it. They just shrugged it off as simple eccentricities. But there was something in his time-worn eyes as he aggressively slopped the black paint over his exterior walls, something almost frantic and maniacal that made me hesitant to approach him. I've always gotten along with Henry, have since I was a little tyke. Even though I'm almost 35 now, I don't remember him looking very young. The house in which I live is the same one I grew up in. After my father passed, just a little after my 18th birthday, I felt no desire to move out. The mortgage was paid off some years before his car went off the road on the outskirts of town, so I just stuck around. With his life insurance, I was able to spruce up the place a bit and make it more my own than some monument to the dead. It was always my old man in me for as long as I can remember. My mom apparently didn't survive my birth, but my father was the most loving and caring parent you could imagine. Yeah, he had a few relationships over the years, but none that stuck around for long. With that portion of his heart still exclusively possessed by the one he lost the day I was brought into this world. I still remember the day I lost him, as if it was just yesterday. He was only planning to be gone for a few days, some business trip of some kind. He was a bit of an entrepreneur, my old man. He had his hands in a lot of creative ventures. It made us a good living, even if he never really got into much detail with me about it. I asked him where he was going that morning. He just gave me that classic smirk. Never too far away, Jackie boy, he told me. Just like he said every time he headed out on one of these trips, whether going to the other side of the country or just a few towns over. Jackie boy. He always called me that, even though he named me Jack after his father. To the rest of the world, I was simply Jack Corrigan, but I was Jackie boy to him and him alone. And I miss him still, so damn much, every single day. But none of that's important or relevant to what's going on with Henry Rowland. The point is that ever since I was a kid, I was friendly with Rowland and even enjoyed some of his crazy stories and theories. We maintained something of a relationship through the years, even when kids at school would give me shit for being buddies with the resident nutcase. I can't say I ever paid much attention to that sort of childishness, even when I was a child myself. At first, when I walked over to Henry's house to see him practically lathering his walls in jet black paint, I was worried, you know? He had to be pushing 80 at this point, but his movements were so erratic. I was scared that he was having some sort of episode. All things considered, he was in remarkable shape for his age and hadn't suffered many medical issues in his past. Even with that, I just knew that something had to be going on with him. No medical issues, yes, but no one could deny that he had some serious ghosts upstairs, lurking beneath his haunted brain pan. Finally building up the nerve to approach him after standing before the already blacked-out wooden fence still reeking of wet paint for God knows how long, I just called out his name. He didn't respond at first, just kept slapping his paint-soaked brush against the siding. When I reluctantly creaked open the gate, though, he practically jumped out of his skin. When he looked back at me, his skin so pale, a stark contrast to the already darkened walls that almost felt like I was staring at his corpse. I suddenly couldn't find words. We just stared at each other for a moment. The specks of paint spattered across his checkered shirt and khaki pants, smeared across his face and dripping from his fingers, such a bizarrely unsettling sight. Before I could find the words to ask the simple question, "Why are you painting your house?" he preemptively gave me the unwarranted reply. "When the lights go out, they can't see you in the black." With that perplexing retort to my unasked question, he just turned back to what he was doing, acting as though he hadn't even seen me or spoken a word. I just slinked back out of his yard, the squealing hinges of his gate only inspiring him to pause the stroke of his brush for a second at best. By the time I arrived back home from work that night, Henry's entire house was matted in that eerie color scheme. He'd even covered the windows with a scattering of empty paint cans left strewn across his yard. I could still see a vague light peering through the glass as his brushstrokes were chaotic at best, but I still couldn't wrap my mind around this. As always, it took me a while to wind down from my shift at the gas station, just down from Grady City Limits sign. But with my normally friendly, if eccentric neighbor's erratic behavior still bewildering my thoughts, the struggle to just settle down and relax was all the more troubled. By the following morning, I decided to just brush the whole thing off as a potential onset of dementia, given Roland's advanced age and already, unpredictable mindset. I was still worried about the guy, but not enough to approach his now strangely haunting house. Over the next few days, this impromptu home renovation became the talk of the town. Many of the regulars at the gas station knew I was friendly with the old guy, inspiring them to grill me about any knowledge I may have on this. But I had nothing to offer. I was still as unsettled as the rest of them, perhaps more so, given that I actually had something of a relationship with the guy. As it would turn out that Saturday, when I was scheduled to work the late shift, I'd get some answers to both the usual paint job as well as the cryptic words which my old friend had shared some days prior. May 18th, 2019, at 1 o'clock in the morning. That was when the moon blinked above the little town of Grady. Things had been fairly busy that night. Yes, this town isn't exactly bustling or anything, even for the weekends, but traffic could be fairly constant at times. This particular gas station, Patty's Gas and Sip, was just down from the city limits, with the next building just a quarter mile or so up the road being Gideon's, the second most popular of the 13 or so bars in town. So yeah, it could get hectic at times. I'd learned to just tune out the especially loud, ass-off-their-drunk customers who would stroll in on nights like these. They could be obnoxious, especially those who had recently earned the right to legally buy alcohol. But I kept one of my earbuds in when working the later shift. Sure, I had to cut off the music if anyone should ask for anything in particular, but I would generally just keep listening when I was just on the receiving end of some drunken small talk. Honestly, I'd never been especially skilled with meaningless conversation from even the more clear-minded, so nods and agreeing smiles made for a good enough default response. There were only 4 townsfolk staggering the aisles of the small convenience store, with 2 more pumping gas outside when things began to grow dimmer. At first, I honestly can't say I was paying much attention. I was just playing a mindless game on my phone with my music tuning out the giggling, obviously hammered group. When one of them shrieked, it immediately shot my attention back around to the world around me. Prepared to roll my eyes at the dramatic performance of the maybe early 20s brunette who clutched the arm of the tall and lanky guy she was with, it took me a second to realize that all four of them just glared out the window. When I noticed not only the moonlight steadily growing darker beyond the glass, I also realized that the lights inside were dimming as well. Strolling around the counter to get a better look at what had the undivided attention of my customers, I felt my breath catch in my throat upon cutting my gaze to the sky. Before I even realized what I was doing, I found myself standing in the parking lot alongside the quartet who steadily whimpered. It's hard to describe and really do justice to the sensation of what my unblinking eyes met, but imagine eyelids cupped around the moon itself, gradually closing. It was subtle, the movement of the upper and lower lids as they caused the shimmering orb to narrow, but the effect on the world around was unmistakable. The lights of the gas station, the illuminated sign, and even the headlights of the two vehicles parked by the pumps whose drivers now shared our entranced gaze, even those grew dimmer, the slimmer the moon shrank. Briefly breaking my eyes from this bizarre sight, I glanced at my phone, the vision of the screen darkening, only hastening my pulse all the more. By the time there was only a sliver of light provided by the night sky, I could barely make out the hand before my face, and when it snuffed out completely, I don't think I've ever encountered such darkness my entire life, both before that night and since. Muffled screams echoed from somewhere to my left, along with far more distant howls from the direction of where the pumps used to be, not to mention my own involuntary moaning. But even these anguished shrieks had no, weight to them. I suppose, somehow the lack of any light made even the sound waves struggle to find something which to reverberate. There was no wind, not even a breeze, as though the world had suddenly ceased its once unending orbit around a sun that may as well have vanished in the same manner as the moon. I was patting my hands against my body just to assure myself that I still had form, but even my touch felt muted, regardless of the fact that my heart felt as though it may break free any second. My feet steadily backing away from the world which had disappeared before me until I felt my back pressed against what I hoped to be the exterior wall of my place of employment. Frantically slapping my hands to the flat surface, I began to attempt to guide myself back to the door through which I had exited, with my head in the disintegrating clouds. I could hear the shuffling of more feet and then steady, muffled whimpers of those I could no longer see. But they were far from my concern at the time. The knowledge that I had some semblance of company in this unimaginable pitch darkness did set me at ease to a point, though that didn't account for much when the other sound rang out across the land. Unlike those empty noises provided by those I hoped to still be nearby, just so I wouldn't be completely alone in this, these rang so much clearly, so much louder, and agonizingly viscerally. They were unlike anything I'd ever heard, or knew how to comprehend. The best way I can describe them is something of a chorus of inverted screams, like something inhaling while wailing, as though the sound should echo into the mouth rather than from it. It felt like the last breath of one dying a most brutal and painful demise, amplified to a volume which could reach the other end of town. Perhaps the furthest reaches of the state compared to my own soundtrack feeling so far away. Though these haunting howls felt distant, I could almost swear that whatever provided them were only inches from my ears. Even with the volume of my rapid pulse unable to reach my ears, the sensation of the hastened tremor within my chest made every desperate breath I was taking almost as strange as if I had a pillow pressed to my face. I knew I had to control it, that I could not allow this fear to consume me, likely leaving me passed out on the unseen ground. I had to, somehow, find a place from whatever was out there, from whatever had been birthed by the moon's retreat from the sky. I heard the muffled screaming of other feet nearby, my chaotic thoughts all over the place, forgetting that I had some semblance of company before the lights went out. Was it the customers from before, or those providing that terrifying sound which now echoed from closer than before? Though part of me was desperate to know that I wasn't alone, my fear would not allow me to call out to the others. I couldn't draw attention to myself or risk giving away my position. It was completely irrational, I knew that, but somehow I had no doubt that whatever was out there had no problem seeing through this endless pitch. Before I exited the building, against which my back remained pressed, my head had already been distant, consumed by the slimming moon above. Had I run left or right after pushing through the door? Surely if I had just darted straight forward when I backed away from the perplexing sights around me, I would now be leaning against the door itself, right? Though my sensation of touch was so heavily dulled, I drifted my palm across whatever was at my back, hopeful that my finger met the latch. The surface was smooth, though not something I completely knew how to describe with my nerve endings so muted. It was glass. It had to be glass. How long had this been going on? How long since the light vanished from this world? The memories of whatever life I lived before felt as distant as my home, somewhere out there in the darkness. It felt like both minutes and weeks since I'd wandered out from my post to see what had made the drunken customers so worked up. When another chorus of those gargled shrieks bellowed out from what could be anywhere from a few feet to a half-mile away, though I knew I had to get moving fast. As I shuffled to the left, keeping my back against the glass, I could vaguely make out something else skidding across the concrete. While the rational part of my brain, which still existed in chronological time, understood that it was most likely one or more of the other people out there with me, the part which had abandoned all reason began to panic. When I felt a dull sensation of something squeezing my upper arm, I couldn't even hope to hold back the scream. Somewhere in the distance I could make out whispering voices urging me to calm my veritably submerged wailing, that rational mind grasping to take hold of my scattered thoughts again. "Calm down," a slightly panicked voice from somewhere far away. "We have to work together." "We have to get back inside," I replied, the vibration in my throat and tongue the only thing assuring me that these words were indeed spoken by me. "Where's the door?" another voice hummed. "Come closer to me," I said, trying to make my slapping against the window of my back audible enough for them to hear. Again, I heard gently scuffling feet, followed by my barely resonating taps against the glass from beside me, each one more distant than the last. There was another whisper that I couldn't quite make out, repeating 3 times over, a little louder with each. The fourth and final repetition met my ears enough to understand what was happening. "She found the door." Over what felt like a half hour, maybe longer, with the hand of my neighbor clasped in mine, we made our way back through the door we had exited so long ago, each step feeling as though we walked through a knee-deep swamp. From what I could figure out from the patches of conversation I could put together, all 4 of those who had left the store with me had made their way into the side of the building against which my back was pressed. We spread apart, each of us gripping the hands of those beside us, moving as a group to the side as the last one in line opened the door. In all honesty, with the lack of any air movement outside, I couldn't tell the difference from being inside, only that we'd passed through an entryway which gently shut after I crossed through. It wasn't until I tipped over what a distant memory assured me to be a rack of sunglasses that I accepted that we were indeed indoors now. Unfortunately, even encased between walls now, those repeating howls from whatever drew closer by the second still sounded as though they were right next to us. Knowing that the sunglass display was right next to the door, I waved my hands before me, attempting to locate the locking mechanism. It took me a while, or so it felt. When I snapped the deadbolt shut, I could count on neither the sensation nor the vague sound to assure me that my mission had been a success. But I wouldn't accept this to be enough to keep us safe from whatever was out there. "We have to get to the storage room," I said, waving my hands around in search of any of my colleagues. All their voices had grown distant. I had no way of knowing if they could even hear me. But when something gently tapped my shoulder, drifting down my arm and weaving between my fingers again, I knew what was happening. After a whisper told me that all of our hands were linked again, I knew that I was leading the way this time. Through the foreign land around us, in search of the door behind a counter which felt miles from where we stood. With one hand free and one conjoined with another, I waved my arm around in search of the aisle between rows of shelves I knew once to exist in this place. It took a while, some soundless stumbling over my own feet, and a few times being nudged to the floor with a gentle brushing against my legs on their descent. But when my fingertips made light contact with what I believed to be shelves, waving them to the other side to feel more presumed shelves parallel from that prior obstacle, I was confident that I was guiding my silent convoy down one of the aisles. Every step was still slow and hesitant, mixed with reluctant apprehension with each footfall. But if any memory served me well, I was certain that the counter behind which the storage room was located was only a short distance ahead. About what I presumed to be about halfway down that aisle, judging by the space between each trudging step, another distant but most alarming sound met my ears, inspiring me to stop in my tracks. Another faraway scream, something gargled and moist but unmistakably human, blended with a tapping against what I would suspect to be the glass of the windows. As that wailing softened, becoming more stuttered, the tapping grew heavier and more dense, when that haunting howl, which was so much closer than before, left that human scream hidden away behind it. I fully and truly understood that whatever provided it was far from human. There was a muffled, wet sound of tearing, causing the tapping sound to quicken before falling silent once more. That silence overcame everything else for some time, before a more jarring and shocking shriek echoed across this little town. It differed from before, like this was a cry of victory, as opposed to an eerie call of something drawing near. It was at that point, as my feet felt rooted to whatever the floor in this convenience store had become, that I remembered that I did not just share this gas station with the quartet at my back, but with the two who pumped gas when the light faded from this world. Admittedly, I didn't fully recall that there were two, until another combination of gargled whimpers led into more howls of those celebrating in the defeat of a helpless victim. Somewhere deep in my brain, I felt shame for leaving those two to, judging by what sounds I could make out, be torn apart. But when a far less subtle sound of something pounding against the glass rang out, I knew I had no more time to waste dwelling on the things of which I had no control. "Move," the voice behind me whispered, sounding as frenzied as my heartbeat at the time. I didn't need a second request, shuffling us forward with more haste than before. When I heard that muted sound of glass cracking, I couldn't know if the lowered volume of everything, but whatever was out there was reliable enough to be sure it had only cracked and not shattered completely. My quickened stroll transformed into as much of a run as my quivering legs could accomplish through these murky waters. I felt as though I was battling. My harried breathing became a cough when my stomach made contact with something, almost knocking the wind out of me, causing me to buckle slightly. My fingers slipped free of my traveling companions as I clutched at my gut before hastily waving my hand back in search of one that it had released. I let out a shaky exhale when it linked in one of the companions again and began scaling what I hoped to be the counter in search of the hatch to pass to the other side. More hollow, cracking sounds met my ears, my pulse racing when I reached the flap to split the countertop. I had absolutely no doubt that whatever was out there, working on forcing its way in, could clearly see us making our desperate attempts to escape, but I couldn't let that break my focus. It was not only my own life I was attempting to preserve, but those who put their faith in me to guide them to a safe haven. Yes, if these things made it through the glass, something I was certain would happen at any second. I couldn't believe a shabby wooden door would hold them back for long. But this was the only hope I had at the time. I felt more items tumble to the ground as I made my way around the counter, that constant tapping and splitting of the window making every movement more clumsy than the last. With each object that hit the ground, the muted sounds as they made contact with a hard surface was the only thing that reminded me that I did not indeed have murky water encasing my trembling shell. The only thing that allowed me to believe that the real world still existed behind this blanket of darkness. My fingertips patting down the shelves behind the counter, what were once cigarette packs and cartons pouring across my legs. I felt my heart leap from its quivering perch. When I wrapped around what I just knew to be a doorknob. As that gentle cracking sound somewhere behind us escalated dramatically, making me picture a greenhouse exploding on a television with the volume cranked to its lowest setting, I had no doubt that the five of us were no longer alone in the building. I pulled open the door, the fingers clutching mine, slipping free as something nudged my body to the side. Again, I scrambled my hand in search of another, as a second and third nudge caused me to almost topple to the floor. When another set of fingers intertwined mine, stabilizing my swaying frame before yanking me to one side, I heard another muffled scream while more items tumbled across my legs. More shredding and tearing met my ears, while there was a far more audible heaving breath upon me. I could feel my hair being gently blown, while a muted yet sickening stench met my nostrils. As such an ear-piercing inverted wail almost deafened me, spitting spatters of some sort of liquid across my face, I felt an arm being yanked again, and my feet dragging behind me. A distant sound of a door being slammed shut, an ambient clicking, allowing me to hope to God that I was on the inside of that now locked shut entryway. An ambient clicking, allowing me to hope to God that I was on the inside of that now locked shut entryway. My legs gave out, and my descent to the floor, feeling so slow and dragged out, perhaps due to the fingers still entwined between my own. I felt a dull sensation of my impact with the hard ground, causing me to buckle once more. The gentle rattling of a door and light taps against it that I knew to be far more violent pounding in reality made even the slightest sensation of hope drift away from me as I still lay on the floor. As I heard a far-off noise of splitting wood and haunting animalistic moans, I knew that our desperate escape had been for nothing. All I could do now was wait for the end. Just sit there and await my own body being torn apart, just like those two that I had left to die in the parking lot. Bracing for my imminent brutal death, my entire body as tense as the crackling door once was, I felt the hand release mine, realizing its owner had been sitting beside me as I shivered on the tiles. I begged for the fingers to reach for me once more, to not leave me to suffer alone. I can't explain how or why, but I knew they wouldn't. I knew they were leaving, prompting my next desperate words. "Don't go. Where are you even going?" I heard a whispered reply in my ear. Between the volume of my quickened pulse gradually ramping up against my eardrums and that splintering wood growing significantly louder, I couldn't fully make out what words were being spoken. But there was a bizarre familiarity to them that I couldn't shake. As a fragment of light flickered on before eyes which had only gazed into the deepest pitch of the darkest night for what could be hours or even days, I could vaguely make out a shadowed form rushing the door ahead of me. When the silhouette reached out, the wood completely split down to the center. Though this fragment of light was dim at best, it gradually grew brighter and brighter, revealing a strangely out-of-focus, jagged and inhuman limb, which appeared as blackened shadow made flesh as it forced itself between the two halves of what was once a door. Just as a hauntingly glossy black eye came into view, peering through the splits, that shadowed form from within the room shot forward. What remained of the door blew apart, throwing splinters of wood back out into the store. Something heavy hit the counter, another one of those eerie howls, silencing with a resounding impact of two solids striking one another. As the light grew brighter, even the ambient sounds of the world around us, shockingly loud to senses which had grown accustomed to muted echoes and silence, another series of those anguished wails broke out. But there was something very different about them now. What was once a chorus of confident, goal-driven battle cries was now something of agony and fear. I heard heavy feet beating against the ground and more glass shattering before one final pain-stricken moan rang out, falling into silence as quickly as it began. I blinked against the light, provided by the fluorescent lights in the store, beaming through the blasted open door. The whimpers of those with whom I shared the storage room blending with those I hadn't realized were coming from my own mouth. After a time, I broke my watering eyes from the busted open doorway before me, finally secure in the belief that those things were not coming back. Turning my attention back to the others sharing the room with me, I saw that the two young women and the tall guy huddled together, crying upon one another. But no sign of the fourth. Choosing not to speak for the time being, not quite ready to find out if my voice still sounded like it used to, I just got to my feet and hesitantly made my way out of the room. The sights which quickly came into focus: the cracked and buckled countertop, items heavy and light scattered across the floor throughout the shop, and most especially the blood, viscera, and strewn apart flesh, bone, and organs spread across the room before me once more turned my legs into gelatin beneath me. I had to believe that these grotesque remains pasted to the walls, ceiling, and floor had been what was left of the fourth member of the quartet with whom I'd made my way down the aisle. But it was hard to believe that this much carnage could come from only one person. It took me some time to convince myself to get back to my feet again. The rancid stench of human remains, much more potent than I would have imagined, finally inspiring me to practically sprint for the door. Of course, when my eyes met the far more widespread display of dismembered parts pasted to the shattered windows and tarmac, this did not help my fragmenting mental state in the slightest. The Grady Police Department had their hands full by the time the sun began to arise over the small town in ruins. It would seem that each corner of this humble city had been laid to waste that night, with the exception of a handful of homes and businesses which had managed to remain unscathed. Amongst those buildings was one of the only houses on my street which had been left untouched. It was the one which had been lathered in black paint some time before the moon blinked shut. To this day, I never asked Henry what compelled him to renovate his home in such a manner, or how he knew that this would keep him safe. Perhaps some questions are better left to the imagination. I did, however, once I had rebuilt the damage to my father's house, chose to follow the old man's example, as did every other house in my neighborhood. And many more homes and businesses alike, though nothing like this had ever occurred before, as far as I know. Maybe this will help should the moon blink again someday. From what I've been able to put together between my own haunted memories and the recollections of those with whom I've spoken about that night, the blink itself only lasted for maybe 10 to 15 minutes in real time. Real time in this version of what is real. Maybe that darkness sent this little town somewhere else, where such chronological rules do not exist. Perhaps our perception of time was as muted as every other sense in that seemingly unending pitch. It could be as simple as the effect of fear discombobulating dysfunction of our brains. Who knows? It's probably for the best that I don't have all the answers, if any, about what really happened when the moon blinked. It wasn't until some months passed by after the town had recovered from this waking nightmare Once what remains of the dead the creatures had left behind were cremated or buried when I returned to my job at the gas station. Patrick Abernathy, Paddy, as he instructed me to call him since my first day, the owner of the place, assured me that everything was back in working condition when I arrived for my shift. I'd requested to be moved to the day shift, the dark of even the most moonlit nights still enough to leave my mind in a bit of chaos. He assured me that he was working on it, but we would be short-staffed for a while until he could replace those who had either not survived that night or just outright quit. If nothing else, things were quiet that first night back. Both a good and a bad thing, given my new profound phobia of silence. Naturally, I kept one of my earbuds in, my chosen soundtrack aiding on the whittling away of the tedious hours. It wasn't until I had to grab some things from the storage room when my wandering eyes noticed something scratched into the floor where I had been sitting fearing for my life not so long ago, that my already fragile thoughts practically threw themselves back to that dark night. It was subtle, just barely etched, deeply enough to be visible, vague enough to be missed while a construction crew took care of the rebuilding of this place. But I knew the instant I saw it that it had been left for me and me alone. Back then, I had simply assumed the shadow figure who held back those that battled to enter the room was the fallen member of the quartet with whom I survived that night. Perhaps I just chalked up to that last scream before someone dragged me through the door, slamming it shut behind them was one of those who pushed past me to enter, the fear taking hold of them. With how uncertain the source of any muffled sound was that night, it was easy to assume that it could have come from inside the room rather than my back. But my legs gave out again, leaving me on my knees on the floor that almost served as my final resting place. The words inscribed into the tiles echoed that parting whisper I'd not been able to make out that night. Whether he had found a way to inscribe this while we sat together awaiting the end in hopes that I may see it before the darkness consumed me, or the whisper itself somehow carved into the fabric of reality, the message and who left it was undeniable. Never too far away, Jackie boy.